Go. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for dialing into our Hangout on Air today where we'll be discussing interstitial ads best practices to help you increase your earnings potential. My name is Risa from the Online Partnerships Group.
And my name is Ahmed, and I'm in the same team looking after Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka publishers.
Thank you so much for making the time to join us today, and we hope you pick up some new things today. So let's kick things off.
Let's start.
All right, a quick overview of today's agenda. We'll be discussing 3 things today. The first section will be all about interstitial ad overview and best practices when it comes to implementation. The second part will be about what metrics that you should be looking at in the AdMob reports. So we'll do a deep dive on match rate and show rate. And finally, Ahmed will take us through how to do A/B testing with Firebase. All right, so first things first, what are interstitial ads? Interstitial ads are full-page ad units that are served between screens during mobile app navigation. And as you can see, you can serve different types of formats. You can have an app install ad, an image ad, a text ad, or even video ads in the interstitial format. Having said this, it makes it very attractive to advertisers as it's a good format to serve different type of marketing objectives. Because it's also a full page ad unit, most of the time it has very high click-through rates. And finally, the third benefit for publishers like yourselves is that it's very simple to implement interstitial ads. So to set up interstitial ads, it's very simple. All you need to do is create an interstitial ad unit in your AdMob accounts and follow the code provided by AdMob. You can also follow the steps provided on AdMob Help Center. As an additional guideline, when you create an interstitial ad unit, you should also check the video format as well. Doing this can increase the auction pressure and increase your overall earnings potential. When we do a comparison between interstitial ads versus banner ad formats, we see that interstitial and video interstitials definitely have stronger performance. The global average for the earnings potential, when we look at CPM in all app categories, is that an interstitial ad can provide you 5 times as much CPM versus a non-interstitial ad format. And then when you open it up to a video interstitial, then the CPM goes up to 6 times that of a non-interstitial ad format. So let's kick things off. What are the common mistakes that we see in the region when it comes to interstitial ad implementations? I'll be talking about 4 general themes that we see. The first one is the unexpected launch of an interstitial. Second is interstitial ads on app start or app exit. The third one is common mistakes when it comes to implementing interstitial ads in between pages. And finally, it's the repetitive interstitial ads. Number 1, unexpected launch. So you must remember that you're not allowed to display an interstitial ad unexpectedly without any user interactions. The reason for this is that it can cause accidental clicks and harm the overall user experience. When you do have accidental clicks, what we then tend to do is that we debit your total earnings, and it harms, again, the overall app user experience. Take a look at this big no-no. This is the disallowed implementation when it comes to user experience. So you have the app screen, and then after that, you display an interstitial ad after a few moments automatically, and then you go back to the app screen. The allowed implementation here is that you have to make sure that there is user interaction, then you show an interstitial ad, and then you switch to another screen in the app. Again, never show an interstitial ad unexpectedly. The second common mistake that we see is that some publishers display an interstitial ad before the app launches or after it closes. Here's an example of the disallowed user experience. You launch the app, you click it from your homepage, you show an interstitial ad, and then that's the only time that you show the main screen of the app. The right way to do this is this user experience or this flow that we're showing on screen right now. First, you launch the app. Second, you display a loading screen. Third, you show an interstitial ad. And finally, you go to the main screen of the app. We recommend that you follow this format, especially since this is the right way to show interstitial ads at the very beginning. When it comes to showing interstitial ad right before the app closes, this is a big no-no. So a user closes the app and then you show an interstitial ad and finally it goes to the home screen. The other way to do it wrongly is you close the app, the user is back to their home screen, and then you show an interstitial ad afterwards. Always remember this app exit logic. So, for instance, they're on the current page, they click the back button, and then on the back end, you check whether an interstitial is preloaded or not. If yes, show an interstitial ad, allow them to close that interstitial ad, and then have a confirm quit page. The other part of this flowchart is if there is no interstitial ad loaded after they click the back button, then automatically lead them to the confirm quit page. The third biggest mistake that we see when it comes to implementation of interstitial ads is the in-between pages. So here are some of the guidelines on when to show an interstitial ad in between pages. Most common uses would be after a user completes a task, after one or more game stages, after doing or going through a different number of screens within your app, and finally between X number of horizontal swipes. Here's the disallowed implementation when it comes to interstitial ads in between pages. So, for example, a user chooses an action, then the next page is loaded, and then an interstitial ad pops up shortly after next page is loaded, and then you lead them to the page that they wanted to go to. The right way to do that is, for instance, they click on a subsection in your app. In the screenshot that you see here, they're clicking that calendar icon. Once they click that, they want to enter that section. So you show an interstitial ad, and after that, the next page or that calendar subsection is loaded. Here's the recommended interstitial ads logic for you guys to follow when it comes to implementing interstitial ads in between sections or pages of your app. So we've divided it in terms of the user interface as well as the ad request flow. So an example here is you show the game title, a player plays the game, then maybe they die after a certain number of rounds or levels. After that, there's a chance for them to retry or go back to playing the game again. At that point, that is a very good place to show an interstitial ad. So you have that part of the gameplay where you can check whether an ad is loaded, and if so, show an interstitial ad. If not, let them go back to the gameplay screen or the home screen. And finally, it's all about repeated ads. remember that you're not allowed to display an interstitial ad right after another interstitial ad closes. And this goes back to the whole user experience, right? You don't want to irritate your players or your users by showing them interstitial ad one after the other. So here's the visualization of the disallowed implementation when it comes to repeated interstitial ads. So first, the user interacts with your app. After that, you display an interstitial ad. And then after that, you display another interstitial ad right after the previous ad is closed. And then you lead them to another section in the app screen. As a user yourself, think about what would be a better experience. What are the most seamless areas of your game or of your app where you can show ads? All right, now I'll move on to the second part of this Hangout on Air, which is all about what metrics that you should be looking at in your AdMob reports. So there's two main metrics for you guys to look at. One is the match rate, the second one is show rate. Match rate is the percentage of ad requests that were filled with an ad. So it's match requests over the total number of ad requests. This is how often AdMob finds and serves your app an ad for every request that you make from the app. Now the show rate is all about impressions over matched requests. So show rate is the percentage of returned ads that were displayed in the app to the user. For example, if your show rate is 25%, it means that only 1/4 of ads that the app is given is actually shown to a user and counts as an impression. So what should you do if you have low match rates? So if the value is too low, which is less than 40%, here are some of the reasons or causes for that. One is you might be calling reload the ad too many times. Remember that you should only reload once or twice. So that's usually the general cause for having low match rate. What should you do then? So you should check your floor settings, what ad filter that you have, as well as since match rate is a function of the demand, maybe you can also potentially use mediation to increase this. Now with show rate, if show rate is too low, these are some of the potential reasons for that. The first one is ad has been preloaded, but users don't reach the placements, which is why it doesn't lead to an impression. So what should you do? Number one, you should really try to find more placements where you could potentially be showing interstitial ads. So think about, is it better to put it on app open, app exit, or what are the break points or between pages that you can show an interstitial ad? Later on, Ahmad will be talking about how to use Firebase A/B testing so that you can show and find out what are the right areas of your app to show an interstitial ad. And the last common case of why you have a low show rate is that maybe you preload too much, meaning you request so many ads, you request them too often, which is why your overall show rate goes down. Remember this guideline that you should only preload once or twice. On the flip side, the other problem is, or something to watch out for, is when your show rate is too high, right? When we talk about a very high show rate, that means that's more than 80%. The general causes of a very high show rate are the following. Number one is you might be showing too many ads, right? One of the guidelines that we have is that if you show more than 6 impressions per session, what you have to do is double check whether that's actually the right approach. It might be too much, and it might hurt the overall user retention, user engagement time. Again, you can use and check these metrics using Firebase. And another reason why a show rate might be too high is that you show ads right after it's done loading, or you show ads suddenly. So again, check the best practices to control ads. When we talk about control, it's all about preloading and then showing the ads. And again, you can use Firebase to A/B test to show ads on the right placements. And with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Ahmad, who will talk more about what are the types of A/B testings that you can do in Firebase.
Thank you, Riza. Now that you have an understanding of what are the best ways to implement an interstitial, let's think how you can actually achieve the whole implementation itself. And for this purpose, I'm going to talk about a very powerful tool, which is called Firebase. As many of you already know, with Firebase you can use analysis and analytical power to understand what's happening inside the app. But what you might not know or might not be very well versed with would be that it's also a powerful optimization tool which allows you to run many experiments. And this is what I'm going to focus today in this session of the presentation. All right, so what are the two features that you can deploy to optimize interstitial placement as well as the effectiveness of interstitial ad unit? One is remote configuration, which allows you to change the behavior of an app in real time without needing to update an app every time. This is a very powerful developer companion tool which has recently got a lot of traction among the developer community. Second, you can also use this feature to run A/B tests and find out what's the best performing parameter that would fulfill the goal that you have in terms of the user engagement or the session length or retention and so on and so forth. Let's look at what used to happen in terms of a developer journey before this powerful Firebase functionality. Previously, there was no limit on the frequency or the number of ads that you could show inside the app. This was easy, that was a default setting, but that also had a harmful effect in terms of user annoyance because ad exposure was sometimes not optimal or not to the degree in which the publisher had a control over it. Second, in order to implement an ad, you had to declare a policy. And this policy had to be updated each time because of the certain Google policies. You had to release an update to update that policy within the app itself. Similarly, for frequency capping, there was a feature available in AdMob console, but we had a feedback that using that feature was sometimes not very intuitive for some of the developers. So we have addressed all of this thing with the Firebase remote configuration functionality, which I'm going to talk about in more detail now. So what exactly can we do with Firebase? As I mentioned earlier, you don't need to update an app. You can run different experiments based on certain demographical data or certain user segments and apply different strategy and then compare and contrast the results based on what is happening inside your app. And this allows you to find the optimal strategy, which kind of compares different values. For example, if you want to know what's the engagement time versus what's the revenue increase, so you can see a holistic picture of all these functionalities and all these parameters by checking out the right experiment set. The only two steps that you need is a Firebase remote configuration SDK integration as well as the extra codes that remote configuration would require. And I'll give you some of the examples to help you better understand. Let's think what are the two main things that we need to consider when optimizing an interstitial ad. One, I recommend you look at the frequency capping time. So how that would determine how much ad exposure you are giving to the user. And the other is ad placement. Where exactly do you want to place the ad? Riza has just shown you many examples of correct ad placement, which is consistent with a superior user experience. But you can also actually implement them with Firebase to understand what is the best balance between user experience and monetization potential. So for optimization of ad frequency with Firebase, there are 3 critical steps. First, you need to add a new parameter in remote configuration, and then you implement the code snippet that it generates to put it inside the app as APK, and then you conduct a A/B test over a certain period of time so that you have a samples on which you can make a decision. Let's look into actual example of how this is done. So parameter key, let's say we want to set a interstitial frequency for 2 minutes, that is 120 seconds. We'll set the parameter key interstitial interval, and we'll set the default value as 120, and then just add the parameter. This would allow us to set the value inside the algorithm. After that, we'll be generating a code. This is what the code would look like. You need to add the code to adjust the frequency based on this parameter value, which we earlier set for 120 seconds. And voila, that's how we actually set the first set of the ad frequency metric. Note that you have to have a goal, what you want to achieve while you are measuring with the parameter. For example, in this example, I used daily user engagement as a key goal that I want to measure. So I want to expand this experiment over 100% of users. I'll set the 100 as a value. If I want to limit it to 50%, I'll adjust accordingly. And this is how you can actually make a staged rollout instead of making a full rollout, which used to happen earlier when the app update used to release as in one go. Other metrics that you can track includes retention, engagement, ad impression, volume, and click rate as well. So let's look at it in unison. This is the control group that you can do. So for example, you want to check 3 different parameter value. One you would select as a control group, which will remain as the same no change group. The other would be 60, which is sort of more aggressive, and then there is a higher frequency which is set as 120. And between these 3 segments, you will try to run an experiment to see how that is impacting daily user engagement and what are the values that are returned for each of these experiments. Setting a control group is very important because that allows you to set a reference. On the basis you can check the effectiveness of the different experiments. So this is how the experiment results would look like. You will have all the metrics that you have selected reported for each of the experiment against the overall dashboard. So let's look at the example that we are currently simulating. We have a control group, we have a lower frequency group with 60 seconds, and then we have a higher frequency group with 180 seconds. And we have all the metrics: daily user engagement, retention 2-3 days, retention for 4 to 7 days, ad impression and ad click reported for each of the experimental group. This allows us to take a 360-degree view of what is happening inside the app, not just from the revenue perspective, but also from the other things that are highly important for making a sustainable business. Okay, so let's look at what happens after a few days. After some samples are collected, we now have a result of what has happened to each of the metric, and we can understand whether they have increased from the baseline, which is set on the control group values, and compare it with the lower frequency and the higher frequency simulation group. All right, so moving on to the next section, now we have to understand how we can leverage Firebase to optimize ad placement. Again, the implementation steps are three, and just like with the frequency capping group. First, in this case, you have to create a unique ad unit per each placement for the experiment so that you understand what is happening to each of the ad unit under consideration. Then we have to understand that we have added a parameter in remote configuration that helps determine the state of each interstitial ad. So for example, if the interstitial ad is turned on for a certain group or turned off for the other group, and I'll explain it with another example soon. And then last but not least, we compare, just like the earlier example with the frequency capping, we compare the results for each group with A/B testing and try to understand what's the best return on investment ad experiment that we have run so far. Let's look with an actual example now. First, there is a example here. In this case, relates to a gaming app where an interstitial is shown on at a start of the game, and then also an interstitial is shown at the game end. Here, as I said in the first implementation step, you create a separate ad unit for each placement so that you can track that particular ad unit with all of its constituent metrics, including ECPM, CTR, and all of that. If you are using the same interstitial name and for both the placements, then it's not easy to compare and contrast. So that's the first step. Second, you create a binary value for each of the conditions and parameters. In this case, the condition is we are showing an interstitial at the start of the game and we are showing an interstitial at the game over stage. So, and the frequency of interstitial set is set at default for both the cases at 120 seconds. So for that, we create a code snippet, and just like the frequency capping experiment, we integrate it inside the app. Now, for this example purposes, we have created 4 groups. One is a control group, which provides us the reference point, a no change group, where everything is the same as before the experiment. So no interstitial before the start of the game, nor an interstitial at the end of the game. Then we have a 25% group, a user group, where we are exposing 25% of our users to this experiment, where the interstitial is shown at the start of the game, but not at the end of the game. Similarly, we have 2 other experiments in which we have a game over only experiment, where the end of the game we are showing an ad, and then at the start we are not showing an ad, and a 2x2 matrix where we have ad showing at the end as well as at the start. So this example kind of encapsulate all the 4 possibilities and then compares it with the control group or the no change group. Doing it so it allows us to understand the different possibilities of how we can increase the revenue, but at the same time be mindful of the user experience. Once we do this experiment, we'll have all the values of retention, daily user engagements returned, and we'll be able to understand what is the configuration that works best for our users and how we can maximize the revenue by rolling out the app update completely on one experiment, whichever is performing the best. There are 3 things to note that once you are running the experiments that you can implement. Number 1, always run one test per feature or a parameter at one time. This is because if you are changing too many variables, you are basically affecting the results of each other, and you will not be able to correctly analyze whether one has more impact or the other. So the best practice is run one test at a time and then compare and contrast the results. Second, always keep in mind the average session time for frequency capping experiments, because the average session time is the maximum time that you can consider when setting a frequency cap. The frequency cap could be 1/4 of the session time, half of session time, and so on, and multiples of it. So this gives you a reference point of what is the limitation. If the session time is too small but your frequency capping is too large, it might create incompatibility. Third, always limit the users based on their demographical data. So with Firebase, you can run the experiment on country level, on age level, all the different audience characteristics. You can make an event and then segment those users based on these experiments. If you do that, you will have a very in-depth understanding of how you can leverage interstitial to better increase the revenue, as well as be mindful of the user experience. It's extremely important that interstitial is used in a manner where it does not impact the user experience. And as Riza has mentioned in the start, there are many ways that you need to understand how, where and which place you can implement interstitial. But Firebase allows you to actually use a data-driven methodology to achieve that. With that, this is pretty much all we have for the Firebase. If you have any more questions, I would recommend you go to Firebase website and the links and look at the different sections. There are many case studies that we have shared, also some of the best practices, and there are accompanied videos as well. So you have a lot of resources to refer back to if you have any questions. With that, I'll hand it back to Riza for our Q&A sessions.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying tuned and for sending us your questions in advance. We've received a couple of great questions from the different markets that we have in this Hangouts on Air. So we have audiences from Pakistan, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore. So thank you so much, guys, for sending in those questions. I'm ready to read some of them. One question that we got a lot is that, can we show interstitial ads after splash screen is shown while the app is loading? So in general, it is possible to do this as long as you follow the implementation guidelines that we showed a few slides ago. So make sure that the splash screen shows that the app is loading. After that, you show the interstitial ad, and then after that, you lead them to the homepage. All right. What other questions do you have there?
Well, one of the very common questions that we receive includes, how can we deal with low match rate problem? Please understand that match rate is a function of eCPM, as well as what are the countries in which the ad is being shown. So you have to always understand where is the traffic coming from. There are some countries where you will have a low match rate because of lower advertiser demand. So in order to improve the match rate, what's in your control is basically using the right format. So always try to use the format based on user experience, and within that parameter, change the traffic mix so that you can improve the match rate. We have another question about best way to implement interstitial ad. I guess we have covered a lot of material around this topic, so feel free to revisit the session, and I guess you will have a lot of understanding of that. We got another question of how to get 100% match rate of an impression and raise eCPM. Again, referring back to my earlier thing about the match rate thing. Match rate is a function of advertiser demand in a certain country, as well as the ad format that you are using. So remember that if it's important to implement technically the best configuration, which is available now. AdMob has made it very easy for you to monitor the match rate according to different countries, according to different formats, and then see which format is it where you are having a match rate problem, and then go into a technical deep dive to understand if you have implemented it correctly. Often I have seen in my personal experience with the developer queries that I have got, most of the time it's a technical issue. Developers have not implemented it rightly, or they are using manually a lot of waterfall logic, which then results in a low match rate. But in all the markets, AdMob has great demand, and we expect that for majority of major markets in which the users are, we get a pretty decent match rate.
Right. So just to add to that, I think so Ahmed's right that match rate is really a function of the demand in that country. So for instance, match rates for countries like US might go as high as 80%, but for some developing countries, a match rate of 60% doesn't mean that it's bad, right? But what's in your control also is, since it's a function of demand, is to explore having other ad networks also, and doing mediation and making sure that you optimize using the live CPMs.
Great point. Yeah, mediation could go a long way in helping optimize different ad networks, and then seeing how you can get the best out of them for each country, for each format as well.
Right. I have a situational question here. I'd love to hear your thoughts also, Ahmed. So a publisher sent in their question that they're a hyper-casual game core loop. It's around 3 seconds if one fails early, and you can play it up to 60 seconds if someone completes the game, and then they show the interstitial when someone fails after 60 seconds. Their question is, if one fails quickly, which is 3 seconds, should we avoid showing the interstitial ad? Or should we just show an interstitial ad when both conditions are met, like let's say 25 seconds have passed from last ad and one fails? So personally, my point of view here is showing an interstitial ad for a hyper-casual game every 3 seconds is not a good user experience. So I would avoid showing an interstitial ad after 3 seconds. What I would probably suggest this studio to do is, why don't you try showing, let's say, interstitial ads, 3 interstitial ads for every 60 minutes, and then, like Ahmed mentioned, do an A/B test, right? After the next minute, add another interstitial ad, and basically you have the control and experiment groups. If you see that it's not harming your user engagement, your retention, then it means that the 4 interstitial ads per minute is not bad. And that's a way to increase interstitial ad usage. Another suggestion I would do is that you could potentially look at other app studios that have been doing hyper-casual games for a long time. So one that comes to mind is Voodoo Games. They do a lot of hyper-casual games, so they're doing a lot of the best practices. See how often they show interstitial ads and scale it in your market.
Yeah, +1 on data-driven methodology to achieve the optimal results. Just like I mentioned with Firebase, that you should run A/B test, and you should compare and contrast the results, and that would give you the best direction for how you can implement the frequency, because even within the hyper casual genre, one game could differ from the other, and you will only understand the user appetite or the user tolerance for a certain frequency or a certain ad unit if you have the data to back it up. So I would highly recommend to use Firebase remote configuration and A/B testing functionalities to better understand what's the best frequency for your ad unit.
All right. Do you have other questions there?
I have another question: how to show interstitial ad in a content-based app? That is, for example, a food recipe app. I guess you have, you are a foodie, and I know you use a lot of
Yeah.
food apps.
Yeah.
What do you think?
So I would suggest that you can consider showing an interstitial ad after a certain number of pages have been reached or minutes have been reached. So in general, understand how many like recipes or how many pages a user looks at per session. And let's say a typical user looks at 5 recipes. Maybe you show them one interstitial per per 5 recipes or per session.
Okay. Yeah. Do we have any questions on the live chat?
Well, let me just take a look at it. There's a lot of Firebase questions and a lot of discussion happening on Firebase right now. When will you support Myanmar and Burma?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would like to tell all our friends and partners in Myanmar and Burma that you should feel free to reach out to our help center for any queries. We have a very dedicated team looking after all the publisher related queries. So feel free to utilize that till we have a dedicated support for Myanmar and Burma. Do we have any other question?
Show rate. So we
Show-
talked about match rate a while ago. What about low show rate?
Yeah, I think this is a great question actually. Show rate is a function of the ad placement as it relates to the natural user experience. So, for example, think about a rewarded ad. The rewarded ad would only show if the users would actually click on it. That means that user goes to the same placement level where he or she needs the power of rewarded ad to achieve certain level upgrade or reactivate the life or so on and so forth. So show rate should be thought in terms of gaming mechanic. If you have a interesting gaming loop and a logic in which the ad unit is embedded, then show rate would naturally be higher because users would actually want to see the ad to achieve certain objective. The other for interstitial or for banner, it's basically a function of the correct placement. If you have technically done a correct placement, it would show up as long as there is Google demand. And as Riza mentioned, for majority of markets, we have very decent Google demand coming for all the basic ad units. So in that sense, just remember to implement and test with pre-caching and preloading techniques that Riza has mentioned at the start of this session.
Okay, we'll take in one more question from the live chat, which is why does my RPM go low even if my fill rate is about 70%?
Okay, RPM is a function of the CTR, which is the click through rate, as well as the advertiser interest, which is measured by cost that advertisers are willing to pay for that particular potential user in a certain market. So if the fill rate is going down, that's just a function of how many advertisers are willing to do that. But RPM in general is dependent also on the format itself. So think about an interstitial where you might have showing up in a certain market where you will have a high ECPM but a low fill rate because the advertiser interest in that market is not high, but those advertisers who are there are willing to pay a lot because they are able to show in the rich canvas of the interstitial all the advertising messaging that they want to project. So it's a function of what you can do in this case is always implement it in the right form, in the right placement, and make sure that if you're using, for example, a native ad, all the best techniques in terms of using the right color, the icon, the messaging is customized so that it becomes very enticing and appealing and people actually click on that ad. Because CTR is something that's clearly in your control. With the right format optimization and leveraging the right ad format, you can increase the CTR, and by that you will also increase the eCPM.
Okay, we have a lot of follow-up questions, I guess. One question that I get asked a lot also is how do we improve eCPM then for a lot of developing countries or a lot of Asian countries, since we know that it's not necessarily or directly in our control. So usually what I would advise to do is really understand which of your ad formats can generate you the highest CPM. I think ad formats is something that's within your control. We saw in the first few slides that using interstitial is 5 times as much as your banner ad placements. So you could potentially exchange those lower CPM formats to higher eCPM formats. Another thing that you can do is make sure and ensure that you're opting in to all the different formats when it comes to interstitial ad usage. So make sure you have image, rich media, video. Having these different formats can increase your auction pressure and generally give you better eCPMs.
Absolutely. Plus one on this thing, you should opt into as much of demand sources as possible. Video especially in general has a very high eCPM, so don't forget to opt in video unless and until you have a very clear business rationale of not doing so. The other thing about Asian countries eCPM is that although there might be scenarios where we might have low fill rate in these countries, however, you have to understand the users here are more tolerant of ads. So this is a luxury that you don't have in developed countries, and you can actually, at the end of a day, if the revenue is the key goalpost that you are after, you can generate almost as much revenue with even lesser fill rate, but at the same time using the right format and increasing the ad exposure. All right. Do we have one last question?
A lot of it is actually show rates and match rates.
I would just reiterate my point about the show rate. I fully believe that it is in developer control, because as you design an app, as you use enticing ad format, just like a rewarded ad format, the way you place it within the gaming mechanic determines how frequently it is activated by the user, and that is what feeds into the show rate statistic. So if you have an ad which is a very obscure at a very obscure placement, or is redundant, or is not properly visible, then it's likely that people would not click on that particular ad. And this especially is very relevant in case of rewarded ad. For interstitial and for banner, as long as it's in the major markets, we generally have very decent fill rate and show rate as well, because these two ad units, banner and interstitial, basically show on publisher discretion, and user doesn't have much control over it. So as long as user are spending more time inside the app, then they will come across more banner or interstitial ad, depending on where you have set them. So the key point here to remember is that you have to focus on quality applications. You have to develop quality applications which where people are spending more and more time inside the app, therefore increasing the possibility of seeing and interacting with more ads.
We actually have another one on custom eCPM floors. When is a good time to use a custom eCPM floor? Because in general, we usually advise our publishers and our app developers to use the Google optimized floor, right?
Yeah, I think the best strategy is to leave it to the machine learning algorithm to understand where, in which geography you are getting what eCPM, and and customize it accordingly. But if you want to run, for example, for a certain season, if you know that this is a typical
High,
geography
yeah.
that you want to target, then you can set a floor based on understanding. But make sure that you remember to monitor it actively and change, increase or decrease the value based on active engagement. And don't leave it at that, because generally setting a floor actually decreases the fill rate. So if you are having a fill rate problem, I don't recommend determining a custom floor. However, at the same time, if there is a seasonal demand or a case based on a geography, then yes, you may go ahead and experiment with a custom floor.
You want to take this?
Yeah. Another good question that we just received was, can we improve the show rate if we make content ratio within the app 18 plus by showing more ads? So if I understand correctly, the question is, if it's a mature app which has a mature rating, how can we increase the show rate? So as I said, show rate is a function of how users are actually going to interact with the ad. So if the app is has a very decent engagement time, and users find a particular value in interacting with the ad, then the show rate should not be an issue. That would go high because people would actually interact with the ad. Think of a rewarded ad, which is, let's say, needed before you go for a when the character dies and you need a rewarded ad for a free life. Now, if, for example, if the user wants to play more in the game, only then he or she would go for that, for clicking on that, and that would increase the show rate. Similarly, if the ad is implemented in, let's say, after 120-second frequency, then as long as user is spending that much of amount of time inside the app, they will be able to see the ad. If they are spending less time, if they are exiting the app before that, then although you have figured an ad after 120 seconds, you will not be able to see the increase in show rate, because there would be a matched query logged against this ad, but the ad actually would not show up because user had already exited the app. So remember that show rate is highly dependent on user interaction and how much user is willing to spend time inside the app.
All right. Thank you so much, Ahmed. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to send in those questions. We hope it was a valuable session for everyone and you picked up something new that you can bring to you and your team. We'll be sending the materials shortly via email. Please feel free to check out the links if you want to learn more about interstitial ad formats. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you all for attending. Bye-bye.